Thanks to all of you for being here on this very cold evening. I have to concede that I have to admit that I was not familiar with the work of Professor Vijayan till I got this invitation, but this has given me the opportunity to familiarize myself with the work of a person who was obviously a very important figure on the intellectual left. So I thank you for instituting this annual lecture in his memory and for setting a very distinguished standard so far in terms of the invited speakers and the topics addressed. I do hope that I'll be able to live up to the standards set so far, though I cannot deny that the occasion does give me some nervous anxiety. So the topic that we have chosen, the topic that's been announced, Israel's war on the Palestinian people, its past and present. This was decided over a telephone conversation with the organizer, and he made a proposal and I suggested a minor alteration. But while beginning to organize my thoughts for the talk, I realized that the war against the Palestinian people is not being waged by Israel alone. Israel is the tip of the spear in what is a much wider war, waged with objectives that transcend matters of territoriality and identity in the Palestinian region. So the more appropriate title perhaps would be the war against the Palestinian people, because it's a war with many antagonists, because there are many more antagonists involved here for the Palestinian people than merely Israel. Who are these adversaries that the Palestinian people face? There is firstly the US, which was quick to offer its unconditional support to Israel after October 7th militant attacks into southern Israel from across the border with Gaza. You won't find me using the word terrorism here. So I will put that up front. I will stipulate that right up front. The militant attack across the border with Israel and the breadth of support that Israel succeeded in drawing at the beginning at what everybody knew would be a brutal war of extermination was represented by the visits to the country by first the US President Joe Biden, followed by the heads of government of France, the United Kingdom, and Germany. As recently as December 12th, when the extent of the damage done in Gaza was abundantly and horrifyingly clear, the US voted against a UN General Assembly resolution demanding a ceasefire. The UK and Germany abstained, while France joined other members of the European Union like Denmark, Belgium, Ireland, and Spain in voting for a ceasefire. Yet this call has not been backed up by anything substantive, despite the UN Secretary General invoking a rarely used clause of the UN Charter, Article 99, which called for urgent action in Gaza because he sees a clear and present danger to world order there. And you can see the tone of helplessness in which the UN Secretary General has since spoken about how he realizes the futility of what he's doing, but still will not give up. He'll keep trying to make that point, though more and more it's becoming clear that it's a futile gesture. The war in Palestine is also a war on thought. On the global terrain, the war on thought is seen in the witch hunt of university heads in the United States and the termination of faculty appointments of several who speak up for Palestinian rights. How could a cry for freedom from the river to the sea be distorted by the Zionist propaganda mill as a call for genocide? A call for freedom cannot be a call for genocide. How do they make that connection, right? Yet that is precisely the slogan that led to the censure of the sole US Congress member of Palestinian descent, Rashida Tlaib, whose extended family continues to live in constant danger in the West Bank. It is evident that the demand made by the Vice Chancellor, which is equivalent to the Deputy Prime Minister of Germany, on November 9th, as the German Parliament or Bundestag debated a motion on fulfilling historical responsibility, protecting Jewish life in Germany. His demand that Muslims in Germany should clearly distance themselves from anti-Semitism so as not to undermine their own right to tolerance. If you unpack the statement, you'll see a lot that is wrong with it, a lot that is very disturbing. Is tolerance a right or a responsibility? Is it something that every citizen in a multicultural context owes to people who are different? Or is it something to be earned by all who are different? In other words, do I have to earn my right to live in a tolerant society? Is it something that I owe to others who are different? Is that so? The whole onus here is being reversed. That's what you see. That's the Palestine-Israel exception to all the norms of decent society. You'll find that everything is inverted when it comes to the Israel-Palestine context, right? Do people of the Muslim faith in Germany have to prove themselves worthy of living in Germany by dissociating themselves from the Palestinian cause? We have seen in this country how the war on thought is expressed in the unstated ban on demonstrations in support of the Palestinian cause. There is no formal notification of such a ban, but every time an event is planned, permission is either denied outright or intrusive and intimidatory police questioning ensures that public participation is minimized. So I'm frankly quite delighted to see that this hall is full despite all these odds. What we have now is a narrative that spans the globe, which casts the current attack on the Palestinians as part of a long and arduous struggle for survival of the Jewish people. This was evident in the early rhetoric emerging from Israel and the West, characterizing the cross-border militant strike of October 7th as the worst attack on Israel since the Holocaust. Some even spoke of the event as the greatest collective trauma that the Jewish people had experienced since the Holocaust. The Holocaust has been invoked as the final line of defense. Every time the Jewish state embarks upon an indefensible course, they bring up the Holocaust. That's a final line of defense of Zionism, right? But there is an essential difference. The Holocaust was a campaign of industrial scale extermination carried out by an occupying power in the countries of Eastern Europe. October 7th was a guerrilla raid across a border that had been blockaded by Israel for 18 years after it vacated a 38-year-long occupation. And while the fog of war surrounding that day's events has not entirely been dispelled, we know that the early reports of unspeakable atrocities, such as decapitated babies and mass rapes and sexual assaults, were the creation of the Israeli propaganda mill. On December 9th, the New Yorker, a magazine of some prestige and repute, published an article by the author Masha Gessen, a person of Russian Jewish descent, now naturalized in the United States. The article was about the politics of memory, how nation states memorialize certain events in their public spaces to preserve what they see as essential values for the current and future generations. Masha Gessen, who identifies as a non-binary trans person, so he likes to be addressed by the pronoun they and them. Masha Gessen thought about so as they walked past one of the memorials to the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, Gessen thought about the thousands of residents of Gaza being killed in retaliation for the October 7 attacks. They also thought that if they were to state this publicly in Germany, there would certainly be big trouble. Masha Gessen observes at some point in the essay as follows, and this is an extended quote that I'm about to read out. So the quote begins here. For the last 17 years, Gaza has been a hyper-densely populated, impoverished, walled-in compound where only a small fraction of the population had the right to leave for even a short amount of time. In other words, a ghetto. Not like the Jewish ghetto in Venice or an inner-city ghetto in America, but like a Jewish ghetto in an Eastern European country occupied by Nazi Germany, right? In the 2 months since Hamas attacked Israel, all Gazans have suffered from the barely interrupted onslaught of Israeli forces. Thousands have died. On average, a child is killed in Gaza every 10 minutes. Israeli bombs have struck hospitals, maternity wards, and ambulances. 8 out of 10 Gazans are now homeless, moving from one place to another, never able to get to safety, unquote. So that's from Masha Gessen, right? Now, anybody who has the barest familiarity with the recent events would recognize this paragraph as a fairly accurate account of what has happened and what has been happening in Gaza. Yet the comparison between Gaza and the Jewish ghetto in Europe triggered outrage. Soon afterwards, the Henrik Boll Foundation, named after the Nobel laureate novelist, and the city of Bremen, announced their withdrawal from the award of the Hannah Arendt Prize for Political Thought to Masha Gessen. This is the latest, but only one instance of the extreme acts of cancel culture for anybody who dares to speak out about the atrocities that have been committed in Gaza, not merely now, but since long. Let me cite one more instance of the war on thought before moving on to the war being fought, the real war being fought with bombs and guns. This is about the Palestinian writer and teacher Rafat al-Harir, who was an important figure in the cultural landscape of Gaza. Impoverished as the Gaza Strip is after years of Israeli siege and warfare, it has a rich literary and cultural life. Rafat al-Harir was the curator of a project of writing, poetry, and visual imagery called Gaza Unsilenced, which has been running since 2014. His own writings have been published in global media outlets such as the New York Times, and he has also edited Gaza Writes Back, an anthology of short stories by young Palestinian writers. He was the founder and convener of an NGO called We Are Not Numbers that encouraged Palestinians to write about their own experiences in the English language so that they could reach a wider audience. As an invitee to a discussion program on the BBC soon after the October 7 attacks, Rafat al-Harir debunked all the analogies with the Holocaust. The more appropriate historical parallel, he insisted, was with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Now, anybody who's familiar with the history of World War II would know what the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was. This was the uprising of the Jewish quarter of Warsaw, the capital of Poland today, by people who had been in a state of imprisonment under the German occupation. The Soviet Red Army stood on the fringes of the city, and the residents of the Warsaw Ghetto expected their support when they rose up against their Nazi oppressors. But the Soviet Red Army, it is believed, held back and allowed the German occupying army to brutally crush the uprising at tremendous cost to human life before moving into, quote unquote, liberate the city, right? So Warsaw, so this is Rafat al-Harir saying that the attack is not like the Holocaust. The attack is more like the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto. Now you can see the parallels. This is the occupied people who are rising up against their occupiers and the oppressors, as happened in Warsaw. So here was another person drawing a comparison between Gaza and the European ghetto and debunking spurious invocations of the Holocaust. He was, of course, shouted down on the BBC program, and his remarks later condemned as deeply offensive. And he suffered a fate much worse than the mere withdrawal of an award. On December 7th, Rafat al-Harir was assassinated by a targeted missile strike by the Israeli Defense Forces. Rashid Khalidi, a scholar of Palestinian descent based in the US, and now we'll have occasion to refer to this name, this family name later, because Rashid Khalidi is one of those rare Palestinians who can trace a continuous family history back to the 11th century. The Khalidi family archives in Jerusalem is a repository of works of literature in Arabic and classical Aramaic and so on, going back to the 11th century, right? So the whole question of Palestinian lineage in that region is answered in the family history of Rashid Khalidi, right? So he is a scholar of Palestinian descent based in the US. He's in Columbia University. He holds a chair named after Edward Said, another distinguished Palestinian intellectual and scholar. Published a book 3 years back titled The 100 Years War on Palestine. The subtitle reads, A History of Settler Colonial Conquest and Resistance. So Khalidi identifies 6 phases in this war of conquest of Palestine, stretching over 100 years. The first declaration of war was in 1917, Balfour Declaration, yeah. And this phase in the war goes on till 1939. And then came the second declaration of war in 1947, which culminates in the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. The third declaration of war is in 1967, and that is when the 6-day-long blitzkrieg by air and land, Israel gains control of the entire territory of historic Palestine. And the fourth declaration of war is in 1982, when Israel launches a full-fledged military offensive against Lebanon in a bid to expel the Palestinian freedom fighters from the country. And then we have the fifth declaration of war in 1987, when the first Palestinian uprising or intifada begins. Now, there could be an argument that this is the second intifada, because actually the first intifada was in 1936-39, before the creation of the State of Israel. But first intifada is the usual terminology. And this phase ends in 1995 with the signing of 2 Oslo Accords in a pretense of bringing peace with justice for the Palestinians. And then comes the 6th declaration of war in 2000, with Oslo process effectively dead. The endpoint that Rashid Khalidi identifies for this phase of war is 2014, when the 51-day war against Gaza takes place with massive casualties. What is going on today could be regarded as an extension of the sixth declaration of war, or as the inauguration of an entirely different phase. It could be, you could call it a seventh declaration of war, but that's a matter of opinion. But what cannot be doubted is that there is a deep organic connection between each of these 6 or 7 phases, and its arc bends quite clearly towards ethnic cleansing, perhaps genocide. On December 4th, a statement issued from the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA it's called, the source for most essential supplies and services in Gaza, spoke of a repetition of horrors from past weeks. Civilians, I'm quoting from the report, civilians including men, women, children, older persons, the sick and people with disabilities were the most to suffer. People who had more than once fled the war in other parts of Gaza were being targeted afresh. Evacuation orders by Israeli armed forces had pushed people into what is less than 1/3 of the Gaza Strip. No place is safe in Gaza, it said, whether in the south or the southwest, whether in Rafah or in any unilaterally so-called safe zone. And then on December 7th, we had a statement from the global head of Oxfam, the British NGO, and this is what she says. Israel's so-called safe zones within Gaza are a mirage, unprotected, not agreed or trusted, not provisioned, and not accessible. We fear that masses of terrified people will be forced beyond Gaza itself under the guise of safety. And this is a key point that she makes. This would force the humanitarian system into an impossible choice between helping civilians and being complicit in their forced deportation, right? The only way they can get the humanitarian assistance that they so desperately need is by exiting Gaza altogether, which is equivalent to forced deportation. So Israel is seeking, without stating it out clearly, the forced deportation, the forced depopulation of Gaza. Genocide is a clear object, and if intent is to be proven, Israelis, starting with the top political leadership, have offered up a slew of genocide-adjacent statements since October 7th. Gazans were children of darkness, while Israelis were children of light, said Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who later invoked a biblical story of treachery and retribution to warn Gaza of a scale of destruction beyond all humanly discernible dimensions. The Amalek, he invoked this biblical story of Amalek, which was killed, in a terrible manner. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant spoke of a future for the Gaza Strip that would be unrecognizable since Israel intended to destroy everything in it. President Isaac Herzog dismissed any possibility of innocent civilian life in Gaza, since everybody living there was ostensibly in moral solidarity with the militant resistance group Hamas. Gideon Saar, a former deputy prime minister, now inducted into the war cabinet, spoke of Gaza ending up both smaller and lesser, indicating that it would be abbreviated territorially and substantially depopulated, right? It will be both shortened in terms of the territory, in terms of the area, and the population will also be diminished entirely through tactics of military terrorism, right? Danny Danon, a former ambassador to the UN from Israel, now a member of the Israeli Knesset, spoke of the best humanitarian solution being the dispersal of Gaza's population. Countries that cared should step up to do their bit by taking in Palestinians from Gaza in their tens of thousands. And with even greater crudity, former Israeli cabinet minister Ayelet Shaked spoke of converting the Khan Yunis refugee camp in Gaza, a teeming place of Palestinian settlement, into a football field, and then taking advantage of the destruction that Israel would wreak upon them to tell the world that each country should take a defined quota. We need 2 million to leave. Honestly, that's the solution. So the entire population of the Gaza Strip has to be evicted, has to be sent to different parts of the world. Is this the brutal climax of the settler colonial project, formally inaugurated in the Palestinian homeland in 1917, which gained a new impetus with the breakdown of the tenuous European order forged after World War I? From the declaration of the State of Israel in 1948, the brutal momentum of the settler project encountered headwinds from elsewhere in the world, where colonialism was being dismantled and new sovereign states coming into being. So Israel, from the moment of its birth, has been running contrary to the tide of history, right? The rest of the world was decolonizing. Settler colonialism was being defeated all over the world. It was being defeated in Algeria. It was defeated in South Africa, but that came much later. Zimbabwe also came later. But nevertheless, the tide was moving in that direction. Israel, the tide has been moving in exactly the opposite direction. As Edward Said has pointed out, nationalist consolidation in much of Europe through the latter half of the 19th century led to the commonly held view of the Orient as a, quote, geographical space to be cultivated, harvested, and guarded. It had no people. It was just a blank space with no culture, no people. It was the kind of divine mandate that had been given to the European, white European civilization to bring culture to these areas. That was the implicit kind of assumption of colonialism. This is Edward Said in his the great classic work, Orientalism. A French ideologue of the imperial mission put it with a considerable flourish. A society colonizes when itself having reached a high degree of maturity and of strength. It procreates, it protects, it places in good conditions of development, and it brings to virility a new society to which it has given birth. So the mission of colonialism is to give birth to societies, to new civilizations, right? There's nothing there before. That's the implicit assumptions. The societies at the outer peripheries of the West, in other words, had no prior existence. They were all birthed by the administration of the Western civilizational missions. And to complete this, okay, I can avoid that, I think. So basically, that's how the Zionism begins as a political movement in Europe with the slogan that land without a people for a people without a land, right? Palestine is regarded as land without a people, and the Jewish people in Europe as a people without a land. So it is appropriate and it would be just for that land without a people to be occupied by the people without a land, right? Zionism is a movement that began in late 19th century Europe at a time when the continent as a whole was oscillating between an expansive vision of humanism and a narrow parochial nationalism, right? There were two kinds of political tendencies there. One was kind of more and more inclusive, trying to create wider, more universal kinds of cultures. The other was trying to confine politics within narrow parochial bounds. Colonialism and empire were given and had more or less reached the limits of its expansion with the division of Africa in the last quarter of the 19th century. The Jewish people themselves, emancipated in most parts of Western Europe, were contributing to the arts, sciences, culture, and literature of the time in a manner that had no precedent, right? I mean, we all know what the great contributions that European Jews made to the collective culture all through the 19th and early 20th centuries. It was, as the historian E.J. Hobsbawm has pointed out, a time when the political revolutions and social reforms enabled the Jewish people to, quote, make the second major contribution to world civilization since their original invention of a tribal monotheism that gave universalist ideas to the founders of Christianity and Islam. So, that's the kind of lineage of the Semitic religions, right? You have Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Yet these contributions by the Jewish people, as Hobsbawm observes, were culturally unspecific. They did not come under the title of Jewishness. Since their authors wanted to be simply unhyphenated French, Italian, German, and English, right? They were perfectly willing to be assimilated into the larger culture. There was, in other words, a form of assimilation underway in the modern secular culture of Europe. Alongside the assimilative tendency, there were also schisms developing as narrower identities asserted their sense of threat at being swamped by larger cultures. And with anti-Semitism, or more accurately anti-Jewishness, because anti-Semitism could also be anti-Islam, right? I mean, we sometimes use that word very, very loosely. Arabs are a Semitic people, right? So you could say Israel is the most anti-Semitic country in the world today, right? So anti-Jewishness is a more accurate word. A persistent feature of European life, despite a century of reforms, Zionism as a political movement began growing. The origins of Zionism are associated with Theodor Herzl, who lived in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In 1890s, he is known to have lobbied the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, for gaining permission for the Jewish colonization of Palestine. The Ottoman Empire was then sunk in debt, and Turkey had begun to acquire the title of sick man of Europe. Herzl thought a financial deal would win a favorable outcome from the Sultan. So he offered money in return for the right to colonize Palestine, right? And roughly 20% of the empire's debt he offered as a kind of, as an inducement. Yet he was firmly rebuffed by the Sultan, who sent word through an intermediary that Herzl would be best advised, quote, not to take another step in this matter. Yeah, and the Sultan's exact words were, I cannot sell even a foot of land, for it does not belong to me, but to my people. Right? So this ploy was tried with the Ottoman Empire, didn't work. Herzl's plan was very clear. It was colonization by finance rather than force. As he wrote in his diary in 1895, we must expropriate gently the private property on the estates assigned to us. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries while denying it employment in our own country. The property owners will come over to our side, but the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. So it was not about colonization, no, it was about taking possession of the land and clearing it out of the population that existed there earlier. The Zionist plan came to the knowledge of the Palestinian elite at that time, one of whom, Yusuf Dia al-Din al-Khalidi, a great uncle of the scholar Rashid Khalidi, who we have encountered earlier, actively sought to engage with it. Now, the Palestinian elite is not outright hostile to it. They see that the Jewish people have a problem. And as Rashid Khalidi writes, his ancestor understood the motivations for Zionism, just as he deplored the persecutions to which Jews were subject in Europe. Zionism he held in principle to be natural, beautiful, and just, since the Jews had their rights in Palestine. Yet he was careful to warn Herzl of his plan. Right? The words he used were, the brutal force of circumstances had to be taken into account. Palestine is an integral part of the Ottoman Empire, and it is inhabited by others. Speaking with full knowledge of facts, Yusuf Dia warned that it would be pure folly for Zionism to plan a future colonization of Palestine. The Jewish people had in the light of their persecution in Europe, the right to find a refuge somewhere, but in the name of God, Yusuf Dia implored, let Palestine be left alone. Now Herzl responds to this by saying that, why worry? The Jewish people will come there with their industry, their money and everything, and they'll make the place prosperous for everybody. So, so why worry about that? No, basically he just didn't engage with the fact that there is already a settled population, a culture, and so on, which has been thriving in that area for centuries, for millennia, in fact. Zionism struck pay dirt when the Ottoman Empire went down to defeat in World War I, and Britain and France gained a mandate to divide up its territory among themselves. This was, of course, a secret deal that the two imperial powers arrived at, even as Britain was promising the Arabs, in return for their support in the war effort, a state of their own in the aftermath of the Ottoman collapse. Right? They were double dealing. They were saying one thing to the Arabs, one thing to the Jews, saying another thing in public. But even as the details of the secret deal, called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, were being made public by the Bolshevik revolutionaries in Russia, Britain came out with the Balfour Declaration, promising that it would look with favor on the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So that was what Rashid Khalidi has called the first declaration of war against Palestine. What was it that motivated this Balfour Declaration, named after the British Foreign Secretary of that time? Certainly, it was not any kind of special affection for the Jewish people. Arthur James Balfour was a notorious racist, white supremacist, and anti-Semite. In 1905, when he was a Prime Minister of Britain, he had passed legislation prohibiting Jewish immigration into Britain. The Balfour Declaration can be understood, in fact, as a kind of convergence of interests between anti-Semitism and Zionism. Right? These things happen. These are the curiosities of history, ironies of history. We saw this convergence of interest in later years too, when after the brief-lived glories of the Weimar Republic, the National Socialists or Nazis came to power in Germany in 1932. Anti-Jewishness was written into the genetic makeup of the Nazis, but they were slow to show the full extent of their antipathy. In fact, in early years, their discrimination was expressed in economic boycotts, the denial of jobs and opportunities, and random, though not systematic, acts of violence. We see something like that here also, right, nowadays, right? Calls for economic boycott and so on, right? Just something to be careful about as we look forward. In these circumstances, the Zionists negotiated a pact with the Nazis called the Havara, or transfer plan, which enabled Jewish citizens in Germany in large numbers to migrate to Palestine. They were not allowed to take financial capital, but could convert their finances to physical capital for export. This was part of the process of building up the Jewish state in embryonic form in the Palestinian territory. Between 1917 and 1939, the Jewish population in Palestine increased from 6 to over 25%. The rapid immigration of Jews from Europe caused serious turmoil among native Palestinians. There was an uprising in 1927 and another more serious and long-lasting one in 1936. As this popular uprising or intifada raged, right, that's in one reading of history, that's the first intifada, the British administration felt compelled to appoint a royal commission on Palestine under Robert Peel to inquire into all possible solutions. This was the effective admission that the British mandate in Palestine had collapsed. It was perhaps the first inkling of Britain's intent to scuttle and run from an unmanageable situation of its own creation, right? It promises opposite things to opposite people and then creates a conflict which it is not able to handle. It was also when the possibility of the partition of Palestine was introduced into the agenda. 1939 is when the possible partition of Palestine was first officially mooted by the British Commission. Witnessing all these events up close was David Ben-Gurion, an early Jewish migrant to Pakistan and head of the Jewish Agency for Palestine. Right? He would later become the first Prime Minister of Israel. Though the partition plan proposed by the Peel Commission fell well short of Ben-Gurion's ambitions, he was prepared to bide his time. In 1937, he wrote to his son, conceding that the partition gave him no pleasure. Yet the land was not in our actual possession, he wrote, and what was in actual possession was less than what they were proposing for a Jewish state. So basically the Jews had very little land there, but the partition plan proposed to give them much more. So he said, yeah, let's take it while it's good enough, because at least we're getting more than we have at this time. If he were an Arab, he would have been very indignant. But being in the position he was, he would be satisfied with getting more than what we have already, though much less than what we merit and desire. The Zionist plan was not that the land remain whole and unified. It was not just sufficient that the land should remain whole and unified, but that the whole and unified land be Jewish, right? So that's a very clearly expressed agenda, objective of Zionism, that they want the entire territory of Palestine. They're not happy with the partition, they want the entire territory, right? And that dream becomes true in 1967. But what happens in 1967? They inherit large Palestinian populations and they run into a demographic crisis. How can you pretend to be democratic when half the population of this territory are without any rights, right? So you can either be Jewish or you can be democratic. You can't be both. You can't be a Jewish and democratic state, right? So the Zionist plan was not that the land should remain whole and unified, but the whole and unified land should be Jewish. While waiting for that time when the whole of the land would be Jewish, Ben-Gurion was clear about what the solution of the question of the Arabs would be. And here's, I'm quoting exactly, I am for their compulsory transfer. I do not see anything immoral in it, right? Basically, throw them out. That's the agenda of Zionism right from the very beginning. All through the course of World War II, Palestine remained closed for Jewish immigration. Britain and its allies thought little of leaving the Jews of Europe to the horrible fate that the Nazis had reserved for them. At the end of the war, Britain still sought to maintain its embargo on Jewish immigration, but was met with a violent terrorist backlash from Zionist gangs. And these terrorist attack gangs were led by two future prime ministers, Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, right? Who were from the extreme fringe of Zionism. David Ben-Gurion was the mainstream. These guys were on the extreme right. But now, of course, the extremists are in charge since the last 40 years, 46 years, 1977 onwards. By 1946, the situation was slipping out of control for the fading colonial power, and the mandate was in process of being transferred to the newly established United Nations. In November 1947, the UN formally voted to partition Palestine. It was more than generous to the Zionist claims. The Jewish people, though less than a third of the population of Palestine, despite the surge in numbers after World War II. After 1945, there was a large surge of immigrants, mostly illegal because Britain was not allowing them in, but somehow or the other they managed to come in there. The Jewish people, less than a third of the population of Palestine, were given 55% of the land area, and the designated Jewish area still had a majority of Arabs, while the designated Arab area had a Jewish population of less than 10%, right? So the demographic composition of the Jewish area, designated Jewish area, was very much dominated by Arabs. And then came what Rashid Khalidi has called the Second Declaration of War on Palestine. The proclamation of the State of Israel involved the forced transfer of an estimated 750,000 Palestinians, who either crossed the borders into neighboring countries or crowded into the West Bank and Gaza. Israel disclaims all blame, entirely faulting the Arab leadership in Palestine and elsewhere for the humanitarian catastrophe. Convinced that the small Zionist force assembled in Palestine would be no match for their armies, the Arab states allegedly encouraged the mass displacement on the assurance that military victory was certain and resettlement would quickly follow. Actually, that's the myth of Jewish history, which has been now decisively blown up by Israeli historians. Okay, the reality, as Israeli historians Benny Morris and Ilan Pape have established from radically opposing perspectives, is that the Jewish National Agency, which in subsequent years became the government of Israel, had a blueprint to effect the complete conquest of territory seen as essential to the strategic defense of Israel as a Jewish state. This required the near complete expulsion of Arabs. The Zionist plan was personally approved by the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, and carried out by the Haganah, which was a clandestine militia that had achieved some form of recognition by the British authorities during the Palestinian Intifada and later became the nucleus of the IDF. So the Haganah had been kind of patronized by Britain to put down the Intifada. So they had acquired substantial force of arms, so they were a well-organized militia, as against the Arab armies, which were not so well organized. Many of them were under British commanding officers and so on, so they were badly compromised. So Benny Morris writes as an unreconstructed Zionist, picks and chooses his sources from the IDF archives and concludes, regretfully, that the job was only half done, right? He says that the population transfer did happen, but it was left half finished, leaving Israel with an insoluble demographic conundrum. Ilan Pape, who's been described as Israel's most courageous historian today, sees the ethnic cleansing approved with the highest level of the Zionist leadership as an injustice that calls for restitution. Once the UN partition plan was approved, the Jewish agency hurried into action. Numerous villages within the designated Jewish area were identified, and Ilan Pape provides the details of Haganah's strategy. Picked for early attention was Khizas, a small village with a few hundred Muslims and 100 Christians, known for the natural beauty of its location on the bank of a lake. Late on December 18th, 1947, Haganah troops attacked, randomly blowing up houses as the village slept. A reporter of the New York Times, who witnessed the aftermath and closely followed subsequent events, queried the Haganah but was met with denial. In the face of his persistence, David Ben-Gurion issued a dramatic public apology, claiming the action had been unauthorized. Just a few months later, in a public speech, he listed it among the successful operations carried out by his military wing, right? You disown it, at the same time you claim credit for it. That's a luxury that only Israeli politicians enjoy. This Khizaz operation followed the blueprint of Plan C, adopted by the Zionist leadership in May 1946 and executed by the Haganah from about the middle of 1947. The typical mode for carrying out military operations was laid out in clear detail. All these documents have come to light in the archives of the Israel Defense Forces, and they were opened up, I think, some 20 years back, and that's enabled a lot of research. So that's how Benny Morris and Ilan Pape have managed to uncover all these details. The typical mode of carrying out these military operations is laid out in clear detail. The village will be surrounded by a force whose size will vary with the circumference of the village and the resistance expected. A part of this force, at least half, will enter the village and carry out acts of sabotage by setting fire to and blowing up targets. If the objective is general punitive action, everything possible should be set on fire, and the houses of the instigators and participants in operations must be demolished. What you see in Gaza today it has got a long history. That's a tactic that they employed at the time the State of Israel was created itself. The ethnic cleansing model adopted in urban areas is described in the context of Haifa, then Palestine's third largest city. And here we refer once again to Ilan Pape. From the morning after the UN partition resolution was adopted, he writes, the 75,000 Palestinians in the city were subjected to a campaign of terror. The Haganah was joined in this enterprise by the terror group Irgun, led by future Prime Minister Menachem Begin. Since the Jewish residents were relatively new to the town, they had occupied higher reaches along the hill slopes. And a typical tactic was to pour oil and fuel down the roads, which would be ignited. And when panic-stricken Palestinians came running out of their homes to try to extinguish these rivers of fire, they were sprayed with machine gun fire. Okay, so Benny Morris records that by July, 2 months after Israel's declaration of independence, only some 3,500 of Haifa's pre-war Arab population of 70,000 remained in the city. 70,000 is down to 3,500. And most of this happened, the flight began in December 1947, but the April of 1948 was especially catastrophic when the Haganah laid siege to the city and finally conquered it. Ben-Gurion had clearly spelt out how he saw the future of the city when he visited early in May 1948. This is just before the declaration of the State of Israel. Like May 14th is when it's declared. This is just a few days before. The number of Palestinians was not to exceed 15,000, of which 2/3 would be Christians, 1/3 Muslims. These communities were to be concentrated in two distinct parts of the city. And the months that followed, these plans of displacement and concentration were carried out by newly empowered Jewish military administrators. The depopulation project, moreover, was even more successful than envisaged. As against 15,000 that they conceived of, they actually managed to reduce the population of Arabs to 3,500. The Palestinian historian Walid Khalidi, another member of the Khalidi clan, it's a very large and distinguished family. He's of course senior to Rashid. He's an old man. He's a doyen of Palestinian historians. The historian Walid Khalidi documents how the Zionist aggression under the guidance of Plan D scaled new heights as the British departure neared. Now, Plan D is for areas that were outside the Jewish area as designated by the UN, right? You know, the UN plan gave them 55% of the land, but they ended up with close to 80%. So this was for the territory outside the designated Jewish area. Plan D scaled new heights as the British departure neared. For all the military operations that had been carried out till then, results were modest in terms of the vacant spaces created for Jewish occupation. Plan D involved actions outside the area designated as Jewish under the UN partition plan. Brigade commanders of the Haganah, working in collaboration with the Irgun and other armed terrorist groups, were granted the authority to mount operations against enemy population centers inside or near the Zionist defensive system in order to prevent them from being used as bases by an active armed force. The options included the destruction of villages, setting fire to, blowing up and planting mines in the debris. Brigade commanders were also authorized to mount combing and control operations, which could proceed by the encirclement of the village. In the event that resistance was encountered while conducting a search, the military units were empowered to wipe out the opposing force and expel the population outside the borders of the state. Now, we heard of two towns in southern Israel where the attacks of October 7th were specially focused. One was Sderot, the other was Ashkelon. Now, both these towns have a history which is documented by Benny Morris. They were both obviously Arab towns which were completely depopulated, and they were all pushed into Gaza, and today's Gazan residents are obviously the descendants of those people from Sderot and Ashkelon and many other villages, of course. You know, 2 years back they had something called not 2 years back, I think it was 2019 or 2020, there's something called the Great March of Return from Gaza. They used to organize these protests right at the wall of separation, saying that, you know, we're going to assert our right to return to our villages. And entirely peaceful demonstration. They would go there, they would sing, they would dance, they would shout slogans. And in that 6-month-long campaign, Israel killed at least 150 Palestinians. So it was a symbolic demonstration, but you can get the background to that from looking at the history of these towns, Ashkelon and Sderot. Ashkelon, in fact, was called al-Majdal, and Sderot stands where two villages of Hajj and Najd once stood before 1948. So those are details that I have here, but I think I'm running short of time, so let me just quickly hurry on. Demography has been a constant obsession with Israel since its creation. Ben-Gurion and his successors, always intent on all of the land, faced an intractable problem of numbers when that territorial dream was fulfilled. For roughly 2 decades after it provoked and decisively won the Six-Day War, 1967, this is the third declaration of war, right? Decisively won the Six-Day War against neighboring Arab states, Zionism seemed to settle into another kind of compact with the Palestinians, treating the occupied people as a reservoir of low-wage labor to fuel the Israeli economy, right? I mean, the economy was booming, they needed some immigrant workers. Without giving them any manner of citizenship rights, they were willing to employ them in their industry and agriculture. But that was an unstable arrangement, always likely to fray in a situation of the constant denial of rights, of basic rights. In a research article published in 1989, a civil rights campaigner observed that around then, this is around the time that the Intifada is beginning, right? A civil rights campaigner observed that a movement had begun emerging afresh in Jewish society, which supported the idea of expelling all Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza Strip to neighboring Arab countries, or preferably beyond. Today, with the non-Jewish population in Palestine probably in a majority, because they've never allowed a census to be done, right? Only the Palestinians within the 1967 borders are counted in the census. The population of West Bank and Gaza, we can only make estimates, but it's estimated that they're about 5.8 million total, right? So add that to the Jewish population inside 1967 Israel, that's about 7 million in all. And the Jewish population just about 6.5 million, right? So clearly, the non-Jewish population is the majority in the Palestinian territory. Israel is called upon to shed its pretense of being a democracy, always a shallow one. Hiving off the West Bank and Gaza as an autonomous and demilitarized Palestinian state was a brief promise, insincere and fraudulent at the best of times. Israel is aware that the wounds it has inflicted are too raw to ever feel secure within the boundaries established in 1948. So the Palestinian Liberation Organization was the instrument of the Israeli plan to kind of implement a caretaker for their occupation. PLO was co-opted after setbacks in Jordan, where they were expelled by King Hussein, in Syria, where Hafiz al-Assad. These Arab regimes have also been responsible for a number of crackdowns on Palestinian rights, Palestinian fighters. So they suffered the setback in Syria when Hafiz al-Assad intervened to prevent them from taking over during the civil war, right? They had an alliance with the left-wing militias of Lebanon. They were on the verge of victory when Syria came in with its troops and literally finished them off. So they were pushed into the south of Lebanon, from where the Israelis expelled them in 1982, right? They were transferred to Tunisia. Successive defeats. So obviously, PLO was completely fatigued. Its top leadership, except for Yasser Arafat, had more or less been decimated, right? So because of that state of fatigue, they entered into this self-defeating kind of agreement. Nothing came out of it. Now, what is happening today is, of course, unilateral abridgment of the script. Israel had a script under which Gaza would remain in a permanent state of siege and the West Bank would be a thick patchwork of Jewish settlements with segregated routes of access only for Jews. October 7th was a unilateral abridgment of that script from the Palestinian side. It has accelerated the quest for a final solution that brings all the genocidal nightmares of the past back in vivid horror. So we can briefly discuss the conduct of the war. What is the international humanitarian law? There are 4 Geneva Conventions which were agreed in 1948, right? And then there was a protocol to the Geneva Convention in 1977. Now there's an article in the protocol of 1977 which says that armed groups that fight against racism, apartheid, and colonialism are granted the right of regular armies, right? So they are protected by Geneva Conventions, right? So how do you classify the October 7th event? No, does that come under this rubric of struggle against colonialism and occupation and racism? Okay, that's one question. Now, Israel has in the past argued that it's not bound by the Geneva Conventions in any of the occupied territories because there was no sovereign power supplanted by its military conquest. What it says is that Gaza was under Egyptian military rule and Jordan was kind of, under, West Bank was under Jordanian military rule. So there was no sovereign power there. We just walked in and replaced one form of military control with another. This perspective has been rejected by virtually every expert body since the language of the Geneva Conventions creates no such distinctions. Its protections, rather, are extended to all persons who at any given moment and any manner whatsoever find themselves, in case of a conflict or occupation, in the hands of a party to the conflict or occupying power of which they are not nationals. Israel has added another element to its ideological armament with the claim that after its withdrawal of all military deployments and settlements in 2004, the situation in Gaza has ceased to be one of occupation, since it's no longer in effective control. Right? The reality is that Israel has absolute control over all routes of access to the strip through air, land, and sea. The only exception is the Rafah crossing, where it's about 7 kilometers, and there's one border crossing which Egypt controls. Under constant Israeli supervision, oversight, everything that passes through there is monitored. And it has maintained a powerful military presence at Gaza's border with Egypt and repeatedly intervened by military means massively and at times of its choosing. In 2007, it fomented a series of pitched battles between Hamas and the rival resistance group Fatah in an effort at overturning the results of the Palestinian National Council election of 2006, which the former had won. Hamas actually has contested in an election which has been certified as free and fair by international observers and won that election, right? It got some 44% of the vote against about 40% for the Fatah, for the PLO. Effectively splitting the two and confining Hamas to Gaza, Israel ratcheted up the severity of its blockade of the territory. Israel justifies the blockade on the ground that it's engaged in an armed conflict with Hamas, right? In 2010, when a Turkish ship bringing essential food and medicines approached Gaza's shores, it was interdicted by an Israeli naval task force. Commandos forcibly boarded the ship and killed 9 peace volunteers on board, claiming the alibi that they had met with violent resistance. Israel argued before a formal inquest that it was in a state of war with Gaza, which made its blockade legal and its interdiction of the Turkish ship a permitted action. So, what is the status of Gaza? I mean, if Israel is already in a state of war with Gaza, then how do you view the events of October 7th, right? Okay, we can concede for purposes of argument that there has been atrocities committed by the Hamas fighters in southern Israel on October 7th. But this is not a case that Israel alone has the right to be judge, jury, and executioner over, right? It's a case which calls for some manner of adjudication by impartial global tribunals, right? And if that is the procedure that alone can bring some form of kind of closure to this bloodshed and this carnage in Gaza, then Israel should also be subject to the same rules of procedure, right? And it is most discouraging that there is a body called the International Criminal Court, which so far, since its creation about, I think, roughly 20 or 25 years back, has distinguished itself by only going after African soft targets, African leaders, right? It's brought a number of them to book and including the incumbent president of Kenya. They were trying to put him behind bars. The man has won an election. They were trying to put him under trial. The prosecutor, chief prosecutor, is a chap called Karim Khan. He's a British national of Pakistani origin, and he's considered to be a total washout. So anyway, that is the whole point. When Israel declares war on Gaza on October 7th, what was the state prevalent before October 7th? It was already in 2010 by its own submission before an international tribunal inquiring into the attack on the Turkish ship. It was already in a state of war, right? So the Hamas action that day has to be viewed in that context. So if Israel was already in a declared state of war with Gaza till the morning of October 7th, the events that day were obviously part of a continuum. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres did no more than point this out when he set off a frisson of Fox outrage from the Israeli ambassador to the world body, who called on him to resign and announce that all cooperation with its agencies would cease. That is yet another instance, one among an infinite number, when Israel has used bluster and bullying with the connivance of the US to force certain themes off the global dialogue. But obviously, this is a moment of decision, because at year 75, since the declaration of the State of Israel, things have come full cycle, and the agenda of Zionism, which was always obvious to anybody who bothered to look, but which the Western nations, the allies of Israel, somehow managed to turn their eyes away from, because it was effectively an agenda for ethnic cleansing, if not genocide, has now come out in full kind of public view. And it's a challenge to global order. It's a challenge to our sense of morality. It's a challenge to our sense that in 1948, after 2 rounds of global warfare, industrial scale warfare, which claimed millions of lives, we had arrived at a kind of a set of norms and laws which would ensure some degree of peace. Peace with justice, because peace without justice is, of course, just a pretense. It's just an absence of war, right? Peace without justice is just an absence of war. It's not a real state of peace. So this challenges the entire, all these assumptions that we have lived with. And I guess if we don't come up with answers, not just in terms of doctrine or theory, but in terms of actual practical outcomes, we're going to witness unending warfare. I mean, this could be just be the beginning of a much wider conflagration.